Bird over Chernobyl. My mother's name is Vera Valerievna Komenko. She just turned 83 this year. My name is Vanna Andreevna Komenko. I turned 36 this year. And I currently work as a particle physicist. I was raised in Ukraine and then went to school in America at MIT, where I also did my graduate training. The same year I was awarded a prestigious research position in Switzerland. The doctors diagnosed her with Alzheimer's, and the disease only progressed further. I've been losing a bit of my mother every day since. However, there is one thing she still remembers vividly to this day. And when I would help her bathe in the evening, she would grab my arm and tell me about the great catastrophe. Before the diagnosis, she would never mention what happened, though I was always curious. I was too young to remember, as I was still an infant, and everything I know came from what I learned in school and in documentaries. Nowadays, I would get little bits and pieces of what she and my father, who I never met, had to endure during that time. The following was collected and stitched together from my recollections of over a year of her telling me her story. Little by little, she was 48 when the great catastrophe happened. The year was 1986. I was born in Pripyat, Ukraine. My mother was a pediatric hematologist working at Pripyat City Hospital No. 26, located at Druzhby Narodov Street on the outskirts of Pripyat. She was a woman of sparkling intelligence, having scored the highest on her board exams in the oblast, which according to her was what made my father, a fireman, fall in love with her a decade before. I was born in 1985, and for the year after, my mother was on her paid maternity to care for me. She told me that she began having nightmares beginning in March. It was terrifying. She recounted in Russian as I bathed her one night. Your father found me screaming and sweating. He asked me, "What's wrong, Vera?" And I was screaming, "The smoke, Andrei, the smoke and the fire," and the people's faces disfigured and peeling from burns. "Andrei, I saw hell." Your father took me the rest of the night to calm down. I was so exhausted I could barely get up to nurse you, darling. My mother told me that she would get these nightmares repeatedly. It was more or less the same thing, a hellscape of smoke and fire with people's skins burning off and peeling like burnt paper. In our apartment complex, we soon found out that she wasn't the only one having that same exact nightmare. The neighbors who worked at the power plant also reported having these terrifying dreams. Yuri, who worked at the power plant, his wife told me over coffee one day that his husband has been waking up screaming at night. I told her, what a silly thought, a grown man screaming like a child at night. But she was completely serious. What her husband had dreamt, there was a look of sheer terror on his face that she never wanted to see again. When she told me what he dreamt of, the smoke and fire, I told her, "That's strange. That was what I had dreamt of the night before and the week before that." The dreams became so intense that my father recommended she see a psychiatrist. When I went to the psychiatrist, Dr. Sitnikov, I believe, he wrote me a prescription for some benzodiazepine for my nerves. As I was about to leave the office with the prescription, he said to me, "You know, it's strange that you had that dream. I've had people come to me this week describing the same nightmare you just described to me." I said, "Really? Has Yuri come to see you as well?" And he responded, "Not just Yuri. 7 other men from Chernobyl have come to see me as well." What was strange was that by the second week of April, the nightmares suddenly stopped. That's when the phone calls began. One day while your father was at work, the phone rang. When I picked it up, nobody spoke. What I could hear was breathing, heavy breathing. I said into the phone, "Who is this? Is this a prank? Please don't call back." However, the phone calls came every other day. It was just 20 seconds of heavy breathing, no words. And then whoever was on the other end would just hang up. The next weekend, while she was driving home with my father from the cinema, she saw something that caught her eye in the distance. It was something floating above the trees. I couldn't see it very clearly from the car window. From the distance, it looked tiny, but if you factor in how far it was away, that thing must have been humongous. With the wings the size of a small building, or maybe a bus, I remembered that it instilled this primal fear and dread within me. I said to your father, "Look, Andrei, I think there's something over there, above the trees." He said, "Over there? That's where the power plant is." He wouldn't believe me that I saw the winged bird with glowing red eyes flying circles around one of the towers. He dismissed me as being a woman with her delusions. But I knew what I saw. Yuri's wife reported that he had seen the same thing walking one night to the bus from work. Yuri's wife, she said to me, "Yuri's been saying he's seeing this gremlin. Some kind of giant winged bat with red eyes floating circles around block No. 4. I tell you, he's playing some kind of game. I said to him, a giant wingbat with glowing eyes. Yeah, right, and I saw Baba Yaga at the shops last night. But he was completely serious, even scared. My mother remembers the morning of April 26, 1986. Clearly, as though it was yesterday. I remember that night you wouldn't stop crying, so I was up at 1 in the morning trying to get you to sleep. It was a little before the half hour, and I suddenly felt the ground moving like an earthquake. It startled me so much that I nearly fell back. I feared there was a war that started, or maybe the Americans had dropped a bomb on us. So I ran to the window. I could see that coming from Chernobyl was this bright flash that quickly faded. Dogs were barking like mad around the neighborhood, and when the light faded, I could see this blue, glowing beam that just shot straight up into the sky like floodlights. My mother then got a call at 6 o'clock the next morning from the chief physician at the hospital. Dr. Vitali was on the phone, and he said to me, "Comrade Dr. Komenko, I understand you are on maternity leave, but something has happened. There's been an influx of patients from the power plant and we are short on doctors and nurses. We need all the help we can get. I had to leave you with Yuri's wife while I grabbed my white coat and purse and left for the hospital. When I got to the hospital, it was bedlam. There were ambulances and people everywhere. People were helping men up the stairs. Some of the men collapsed on the stairs and were vomiting. They were still hauling people up on stretchers from the ambulances. When I got into the hospital, I could barely move through the doors. They were so crammed full of people. I said to Polina, a nurse that was walking in with me, where did all these people come from? Something happened at the power plant last night, she whispered. What? Was that what I felt? I said to her, and she said, yes, I think there was an accident. Everywhere in the halls were men from the plant, still in their uniforms, with burned, sooted faces and arms. It was a ghastly sight. I was treating this young fireman, and I recognized that his arms and face were covered in radiation burns. He was groaning in such pain and sweating so profusely. I asked him, where the hell were you to receive these radiation burns? He could barely answer me, that poor fellow. He looked so feverish. I was putting out the fire. We need to get these clothes off of you immediately. Nurse, I yelled. I waved to the nurses and they came and took the boots and coat off of the man. They then took them to the basement of the hospital to throw away. As they took off his jacket, I realized that he was in the same company as your father. I went to the head nurse and asked, have you seen Andriy Yukimovich Komenko? A nurse behind her raised her hand and said, yes, I've seen Comrade Komenko. He's in the burn ward in 28. I ran down the halls and up the stairs. Your father was lying in a room filled with other firemen and power plant workers. By then, they had set up these blue plastic curtains, and I had to go in to touch his skin. His skin was marbled and red and they felt oily and damp with blood and sweat. And his lips were so swollen. The white sheets were stained yellow from his body. He looked like the horribly disfigured faces I had seen in my nightmares weeks before. He could barely breathe, and he just wheezed. He was in so much pain. At this moment, my mother fell silent and began to weep. Mamuchka, it's okay. You don't have to keep on going. Her eyes welled with tears. She sniffled, then continued. He couldn't even turn his head. I was there and I said to him, Andriy, my beloved Andriy, look at you. What have they done to you? And he spoke so hoarsely. Every word was painful, I could tell. Vera, my dear, you look pretty today. The rocks ... They were so hot and I'm afraid my hands are pretty burnt. How's my baby Vanna? I remember that I grabbed his hand and smiled, though tears fell from my face. Vanna couldn't stop crying last night. She was crying for you, her Papachka. Don't worry, he said, coughing up blood. Papachka will be home soon. He was delirious from the morphine. I was called back into duty soon after. That was the last time I saw him. The nurses told me he passed away a few hours later. We were later told on the state news on television that it was only a minor accident. Some block had been damaged on the roof of the power plant, and that rumors of a disaster were lies propagated by Western media. But I knew what I saw. I knew what took your father. He was like whatever had happened weeks before. The nightmares, the phone calls, that thing that flew over the power station. It was a foreboding, a harbinger of the hell that was to come. I know it. Yuri knew it too. He had been getting the same phone calls and saw the same flying bird. I was lucky though. I heard from his wife a while later that he had died from the poisoning painfully and slowly several months after the disaster. Your father's body had not even touched the ground when we were told to leave Pripyat for a temporary evacuation. On the streets, we saw these long lines of buses. There were soldiers everywhere, and men and women with strollers with babies, and schoolchildren. They were military trucks with speakers and this woman's voice telling us to close our windows and turn off our taps. There were other trucks with these men in white suits that covered up their entire bodies. And they were spraying the streets with water. I packed our belongings in a single suitcase, and with you in a stroller. We left our apartment block on Druzhby narrative for the buses for Kiev. We never returned. My mother still kept my father's picture, him in an Ashenka with a red star in his uniform, by her nightstand. The walnut frame was always dusted and maintained in a pristine state. I had never heard about what happened to him growing up, only that he died even before I learned to walk. A while after, I had decided to move my mother in with me to Geneva, Switzerland, where my new job was. You see, I was part of a multinational CERN-affiliated team that was conducting research on the origins of gravity and mass from quantum mechanics using microscopic black holes in the underground tunnels of the Large Hadron Collider. In my first week, I decided to take my mother on a free tour of the laboratories. I pushed her in a wheelchair as we went through the tour. She nodded along with the tour guide, and I pointed to where the white coat scientists were busy configuring data collected from the system. I leaned in and said to her, "Mamuchka, I'm going to be working here as a scientist." She grinned, beaming with pride. "Ah, that's marvelous, darling. Papuchka is going to be so proud when he hears this." When we started walking back home, to the buses, it was already dark. I realized my mother's mood had suddenly dampened. She seemed to become quiet and fidgety, like something had deeply upset her. "Mamuchka, is there something wrong?" My mother stared worriedly into blank space, then at me, then pointed to above the wooden dome of the visitor's center, her hand trembling. She stammered at first, then began to whisper. What she said next sends chills down my neck to this day. The bird ... the flying creature I saw at Chernobyl. I just saw it flying around that dome.